Hi everybody, thanks for joining me as I conclude my examination of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity from an atheist perspective. Before I get into that, you see this kitty I got here? Yes, look at this kitty I got here. She's been largely absent from the Mere Christianity series. She's picked a different spot to lay down while I do this. It's not on camera. And I know she's been missed by some people who saw her during the Case for Christ series. So here she is. Isn't she sweet? Okay. Get lost. Okay, so anyway, as I was saying, I'm about to conclude my examination of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Today we're going to cover the back half of Book 4, Beyond Personality, and that will be chapters 7 through 11. Let's get started. Chapter 7 is titled, Let's Pretend. And why stop now? Lewis begins this chapter by describing two stories. The first story is Beauty and the Beast, where the love of a woman turns a beast into a man, and then the second is an old story, a fairy tale called The Beautiful Mask, although Lewis doesn't reference it by that title. And it's about a man who puts on a mask that makes him appear more attractive, and he wears the mask for many years, and then finally when he takes the mask off, he sees that his own face has grown to match the beauty of the mask. Up until now, Lewis says, he has been describing facts. What God is, what God wants, what God has done, things like this. But now he turns his attention in these final chapters to what Christians should do next, now that they have this factual knowledge of God and His will and His expectations. What should they do? And he says, quote, "If you are interested enough to have read thus far, you are probably interested enough to make a shot at saying your prayers. And whatever else you say, you will probably say the Lord's Prayer." And the Lord's Prayer, as I'm sure most of us know, begins Our Father. And Lewis points out that we are, as he has said in previous chapters, we are not children of God in this way. We are things that God has made, not things that God has begotten. We're not like Jesus is the Son of God. But by praying to God as though He were our Father in that sense, we are actually pretending to be Christ. And this is a good thing, Lewis says, because like the man in The Beautiful Mask, who puts on the attractive mask and then later discovers that his face has grown to match it, we will eventually find ourselves, the more we pretend to be like Christ, we will eventually find ourselves becoming more like Him in reality. And this happens, according to Lewis, because Christ Himself is actually with us. He's actually at our side, guiding us toward becoming more like Him and less like the tin soldier, so to speak, that we have always been. Lewis means this literally. He's not just saying that it's our conscience acting on us or that we're merely making a different choice. It's actually Christ Himself alive and present, and as Lewis himself puts it, interfering in ourselves or with ourselves. Now, Lewis acknowledges that this is not the perceived experience of many Christians. Many claim to have never felt like Christ was present helping them at all, and instead all the times they've been helped in their lives, it's been other human beings doing the helping. But Lewis counters this by saying, quote, "If there was no help from Christ, there would be no help from other human beings." Lewis says that Christ works through us all, and He does this in ways that we might not always recognize, in ways that might not even make sense. And he says, quote, "When a young man who has been going to church in a routine way honestly realizes that he does not believe in Christianity and stops going, provided he does it for honesty's sake and not just to annoy his parents, the Spirit of Christ is probably nearer to him then than it ever was before." Mostly, though, aside from these sorts of episodes, Christ works through us through each other, Lewis says. We're all mirrors for each other, and we reflect Christ back at ourselves and back at each other. And reflecting Christ is one of the main reasons why the church is so important, because as the Christians reflect Christ at each other, they encourage each other to continue following Him, and they amplify the effect that Christ has on individuals by spreading that good infection that Lewis wrote about in an earlier chapter, that good infection of Christ, or that Zoe form of life that he mentioned previously. Lewis also says that although it's important that we recognize when people do help us in our lives, we must also always recognize ultimately that it is God standing behind them who is ultimately responsible. Relying on God as opposed to relying on people is very important to C.S. Lewis because he says humans are unreliable fundamentally. Even the best of us will eventually die. That's the best case scenario. Once Christians begin their transformations into little Christs, Lewis says they will notice two things. First, their own sinfulness, which can only be truly reformed by God. And second, that it is God who ultimately is responsible for everything. And he says, it is even God who, in a sense, joins in our pretense of being little Christs, since he can see us as we really are, our selfish, sinful little selves, undeserving of his love, and he decides to pretend that we aren't these horrible little creatures that we actually are, and instead that we're more like Jesus, his begotten Son. And Lewis says, quote, "Is not that how the higher thing always raises the lower? A mother teaches her baby to talk by talking to it as if it understood long before it really does. We treat our dogs as if they were almost human. That is why they really become almost human in the end." So Lewis begins this chapter by announcing that he's switching gears here as he enters the home stretch of the book. He's no longer going to be talking about facts as he has been, but rather about what Christians ought to do with themselves in light of those facts. Of course, in order to say this, Lewis has to assume not only that there are such things as facts about God, which there aren't, but also that he, C.S. Lewis, for one at least, knows what they are, which, from all indications from this book, he doesn't. Lewis describes how we pretend to be Christ when we pray and we say, "Our Father." And when we try to be like Christ, Christ himself literally comes to us and begins to change us into something like him. Lewis says that this isn't just us making different choices about our behavior. It is literally Christ acting on us and doing something to us. But the thing is, it sounds an awful lot like we're just making different choices in order to follow a particular example that we've chosen. And why do we have to assume that Christ is acting on people to account for these things? Is there really no better way of explaining why some people do seem to be transformed by their newfound Christianity? Because this is something that Christians cite very often, very boldly, as evidence for the truth of their faith, that it transforms people. And Lee Strobel said that in The Case for Christ, that becoming a Christian transforms people. And we hear people say this all the time. They say things like, "Oh, so-and-so was a new man after he got saved," or "he was like a totally different person once he found the Lord." I'm sure you've heard these sorts of things from Christians all the time. The thing is, these changes in behavior can just as easily, if not more easily, be explained without assuming the intervention of some magical, invisible deity, and just say that the people who changed made a choice and have altered their behavior accordingly. It's them. It's not anything that is acting upon them from outside. It's them. And also, this also implies something else. If changes in behavior like that after a conversion to Christianity are evidence that Christianity is real, then why aren't similar cases evidence for the truth of Islam or Buddhism or any other faith you can name? Christianity is not the only religion, and it's certainly not the only religion that claims the power to change people's lives and hearts and behaviors. If a man behaving better as a new Christian is evidence for Christianity, then why is not a man behaving better as a new Muslim evidence for Islam? I find Lewis's statement that a man who honestly chooses to leave his church is closer to Christ than he's ever been to be really fascinating, because at first glance it strikes me as a really tolerant, reasonable thing to say. Lewis seems to be prizing intellectual honesty above even faith in his own chosen God. But then I started to think, that maybe this wasn't such a great sentiment. Look again at how Lewis phrases that. I'll read the quote again. When a young man who has been going to church in a routine way honestly realizes that he does not believe in Christianity and stops going, provided he does it for honesty's sake and not just to annoy his parents, the Spirit of Christ is probably nearer to him then than it ever was before. The act of leaving the church brings him closer to Christ. You can't stop being a Christian even if you decide to stop being a Christian. And this sentiment reminds me of something that my mom said to me when I told her that I was an atheist some years ago. She said something like, oh, well, you know, you still believe in something. And she changed the definition of God to be so vague and elastic that really you have no choice but to admit, yeah, okay, I believe in that. Oh, okay, well then you're not an atheist. You believe in something. No matter how hard you try, no matter how you phrase it, you will never be able to convince some people that you are what you say you are. You leave the church, well, that's just because Christ was acting on you. You don't believe in God, well, you still believe in something, right? I mean, Christianity sounds a lot like pine tar. It's impossible to get off of you. Finally, again, in this chapter, we encounter Lewis's Christian misanthropy. Don't count on humans, they'll only let you down. Count on God, he'll always be there. He never makes mistakes, he never forgets. He never breaks promises, he'll never die and leave you behind. Didn't Lewis say something in a previous chapter about not talking to us like children? And what else is there about humans? We're mortal, we're fallible, and not just fallible, but selfish, petty, jealous, greedy, all sorts of horrible things. And I might counter this by saying, sure, those are all facets of human nature, but what about compassion and intellect and tolerance and patience, and honesty and curiosity? But before I even say that, I know what Lewis and many other Christians would say, that we exhibit those qualities, those positive traits, because God is working through us. The bad stuff is our fault, the good stuff gets credited to God. And from the Christian viewpoint, we can't avoid seeing ourselves as dirty, clutching, contemptible things. Everything good about us in the Christian viewpoint comes from God, or as a result of God acting on us, or our nearness to God. None of it comes from us. Never mind for the moment the various arguments for and against the truth of Christianity. Why would anyone want to believe this? Chapter 8, is Christianity hard or easy? Putting on Christ, trying to become like him, is, Lewis says, the whole business of being a Christian. It's not just a part of it, it's the whole point of the entire thing. And this sort of becoming is different from other concepts of moral behavior. Ordinary moral behavior, Lewis says, consists of us recognizing that our various desires and instincts and impulses are subject to rules and standards which are external from us and which we are bound to obey. And living our lives and making our choices to abide by these standards rather than by our own desires is what we call being good. But this, Lewis claims, results in us either eventually just throwing up our hands in frustration and giving up trying to be good altogether, or becoming very unhappy once we realize that we will never be able to fully satisfy the demands of our conscience. And no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to have full compliance with all those rules and all those moral ideals. On the other hand, there's the Christian way, and Lewis says that the Christian way is both harder and easier at the same time. Christ does not ask us for our time and effort, which we might put into following these moral rules on our own. Christ asks for ourselves, and Christ seeks to kill those natural instincts and those natural desires and replace them with himself. And this is hard, Lewis says, because handing over our whole selves to Christ is incredibly difficult. It takes a lot of constant effort to always be giving ourselves over to Christ. But it's also easy because the struggles that we will face trying to live this life for Christ are much easier than those we would face if we did things the other way. The hardest part of the Christian life, Lewis says, is denying those natural desires by which we are constantly being bombarded. And at first, this can only be accomplished bit by bit, maybe a few moments at a time, but eventually, with Christ's help, those moments of resistance, of holding back those natural urges, and letting the spiritual life take over, will last longer and longer. It's hard, Lewis says, but, quote, it may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be a jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. We are like eggs at present, and you cannot go on indefinitely being just an ordinary decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. Becoming like Christ, Lewis reiterates, is the whole of Christianity. That's the point of the entire endeavor, he says again. But more than that, it's the whole of everything, even the universe itself. The Bible says that the whole universe was made for Christ and that everything is to be gathered to Christ. And Lewis admits that he has no idea what this means or how it would apply to other life that may or may not exist away from the earth. But then again, he doesn't really expect to understand such things, since God has only revealed to us his plan for us. But, Lewis says, the Bible hints that when we all do enter into Christ, the rest of nature will also be made right, as he puts it. And he says, quote, the bad dream will be over. It will be morning. So let's talk about this comparison and contrast that Lewis does with ordinary morality, as he puts it, and the Christian way. He says that trying to live a moral life without Christ will make us either miserable and frustrated, or will force us to abandon the effort to be good altogether. He really loves these false dilemmas, doesn't he? Without Christ, it'll be too exhausting for us, it'll be too hard, we'll have no Christ to help us along, and we'll either become miserable or we'll just give up. That is a rather sweeping statement. It implies that no one outside of Christianity is capable of leading a truly moral and happy life. And how in the world could Lewis or anyone else make such a statement? Well, that's not a rhetorical question. I think I know the answer. I think it's because Lewis, like the God that he is worshiping, that he is describing so lovingly in this book, demands perfection and considers anything short of it to be a total failure. He talks about how impossible it would be to satisfy the demands of your own conscience, or to live up to those moral ideals that we've identified for ourselves. But if satisfying every demand of your conscience really is impossible, then why should we lose any sleep over not being able to do it? Why can't we just do, what I think most people do? That is, try your best to be a good person, aim to always do what is right and what is best, and when you inevitably fuck up, just take it in context. Take it as a fuck up, not as evidence that you are this totally immoral, horrible failure of a person. Just because perfect and nothing short of it is God's bullshit standard doesn't mean that it's mine. It doesn't mean it has to be yours or anyone else's. If God wasn't such a perfectionist asshole, he wouldn't have had to concoct this insane doctrine of proxy salvation through human sacrifice via Christ in order to come up with an excuse to allow morally imperfect people into heaven. He could have just judged people fairly according to their character and the choices that they made and the people that they were and that they tried to be in life, rather than insisting that the least of their sins outweighed all of their virtues combined. Chapter 9, Counting the Cost. So, about those demands for perfection. Lewis says that God is not refusing to help us unless we are perfect. Rather, the only help he is offering us is help in becoming perfect. If we aren't interested in trying to be perfect, then God can't help us. Lewis illustrates this by describing how, as a child, he would endure the pain of a toothache in silence, even though he knew that if he went to his mother, she would give him an aspirin that would dull the pain. And the reason he did this was because he knew that his mother, in addition to giving him the aspirin, would also insist on taking him to the dentist, and he didn't want to go to the dentist. He wanted immediate relief from the pain of his aching tooth, but he couldn't get that temporary relief without also getting something more that he didn't want. And God is like that. God is like both C.S. Lewis's mother And also like the dentist, who not only gets in there and fixes the problem tooth, but also examines the rest of the teeth to make sure that they are set right as well. Lewis says, quote, "Dozens of people go to him," meaning God, "to be cured of some one particular sin which they are ashamed of, like masturbation or physical cowardice, or which is obviously spoiling daily life, like bad temper or drunkenness. Well, he will cure it all right, but he will not stop there. That may be all you asked, but if once you call him in, he will give you the full treatment." Will he bill you for the full treatment, even if you didn't ask for it? Anyway, God warns us to count the cost before committing to Christianity. And the reason why God warns us to do that is because once he starts working on us, he will not stop until the job is finished. That means until we're perfect. Lewis says that this job won't be finished in this lifetime, but God will try to get us as close to it in this lifetime as he can. And this doesn't mean that God isn't pleased with every little bit of progress that we make. God is like the parent of a child that is just learning to walk. God is thrilled to watch our faltering, clumsy first steps. But God also expects us one day to grow up and to be able to walk confidently and stably and upright like adults. God is easy to please, but hard to satisfy, Lewis says. And that's a quote from another Christian writer, George MacDonald. God will pick us up every time we fall. He's like the guy holding the back of the bicycle seat as the child learns to ride the bike. If we fall, he'll pick us up. But his ultimate goal is always going to be perfection. And if we lose sight of this, then we might begin to resist Christ working in us, or reject his help once he has helped us to overcome those particular sins which drove us to seek him out in the first place. But Lewis says this is a fatal mistake. We must not be satisfied with being imperfect but decent people. Why? Because even though this might be all right with us, it's not what God intended for us. And Lewis says that God is the inventor and we are the machines. God wants us to be perfect, and it is only cowardice, not humility, which causes us to resist his wish and his effort to make us perfect. Without God, we cannot hope to last very long as decent people. But with God, no virtue, no level of holiness is beyond our reach. But it's a very difficult job, and Christians should expect that they're going to be in for a rough time from time to time. When a person who is much improved by Christ suddenly encounters hardships, this, Lewis says, is just God's way of pushing him to still higher levels of perfection and demanding of him more patience and more love and more virtue, generally speaking, than he has given in the past, in order to render him a person capable of such things. So when God commands us, "Be ye perfect," he isn't asking the impossible. He's saying that he will make us people capable of obeying that command, unless we choose to stop him, because only our choice to shut God out can stop him from doing this. And when he's done, we will be these perfect mirrors that Lewis has talked about, capable of reflecting God in all his glory. There, see, it's not so unreasonable after all. Maybe I wasn't being fair in the last chapter analysis when I said that God was too demanding and his insistence on perfection was just wrong. I mean, God isn't asking the impossible. If we let him, he'll help us. He'll make us perfect, right? Right. And what happens to those of us who decide we want to do something with our lives besides handing them over to be remade to match God's concept of perfection? Exactly. Chapter 10, Nice People or New Men. Lewis asks, rhetorically, if Christianity is true, then why aren't all Christians nicer than all non-Christians? Lewis's answer to this is to say first, if a conversion to Christianity does not result in any improvement in a person's behavior, then it's right to suspect that the conversion may have been imaginary. A tree, he says, is known by its fruit, and Christians who misbehave are only making Christianity more unbelievable to those outside of it. However, Lewis charges that it is unfair for people to divide the world into Christians and non-Christians by asking this question, and to expect that all the Christians should always, at any given moment, be nicer than all the non-Christians in the world. First, he says the world is much more complicated than this. There are people who are slowly perhaps either slipping out of or entering into Christianity who could not be fairly counted in either category. And there are people in other faiths who have been led by God secretly, Lewis says, to focus on the parts of their non-Christian faiths that agree with Christianity. And also, the true test, Lewis says, isn't that a given Christian will be nicer than a given non-Christian, but rather that a given person is nicer as a Christian than he would be if he were not a Christian. Lewis illustrates this by comparing two imaginary people. There's Miss Bates, who is a Christian with an unkind tongue, and then there's Dick Firkin, a non-Christian with a much more pleasant disposition. Lewis says that the natural forces that have resulted in Miss Bates' bad temperament and Dick Firkin's good temperament are there because God allowed them to be there. God is responsible for them ultimately. And God intends to reform Miss Bates and her personality, and also to show Dick that his positive traits are the result of God and not of Dick himself. But the key is God is waiting for them both to turn to him and to ask him for this help, to ask him to show him these things and to reform them in these ways, since turning to God is really the only reason for which they were created. And how nice or how nasty their natures are is beside the point. What matters to God is that they offer those natures to him. Without God, Lewis says, Dick's good nature will eventually fail him. He says, quote, "As long as Dick does not turn to God, he thinks his niceness is his own. And just as long as he thinks that, it is not his own." Dick's niceness, according to Lewis, only truly becomes his own when he realizes that it's not his own, that it's a gift from God. And given all this, it isn't surprising that we find some Christians who are nastier in their temperament than some non-Christians. In fact, Lewis reminds us, while he was alive, Christ seemed to attract the nasty people more than the nice people. And the reason for this is that nice people are easier to get along with, and they get along easier in the world, and they're less likely to think that they need God, whereas the nasty people find that when they try to be good, they need much more help, and they're more likely to turn to Christ in order to find that help. Lewis says there is a warning here. Nice people must beware, because their niceness is a gift from God, and much is expected from those to whom much is given. And by the same token, the nasty and the poor, he also says, need not despair, since God knows all about their problems, and he's eager to help if only they will let him. Lewis says that we must all work for the best possible world and to raise the best possible, the nicest people, but we must also be careful not to equate this with saving souls. Improvement, he says, is not redemption. And to those who understand Christianity, these arguments about the poor characters of other Christians don't really carry much weight. And Lewis says, quote, "If there is a God, you are, in a sense, alone with him. What will all that chatter and hearsay count when the anesthetic fog which we call nature or the real world fades away and the presence in which you have always stood becomes palpable, immediate, and unavoidable?" So it's not fair to divide the world neatly into Christians and non-Christians? Well, see there, we finally found a false dichotomy that C.S. Lewis doesn't like. I knew there had to be one. Again, in this chapter, we have the assertion that our positive traits come to us from God. And Lewis doubles down on that in this chapter by saying not only that our virtues are from God, but that they impose upon us a greater responsibility than is felt by less virtuous people. So we don't get to take credit for ourselves being good people at all, and the fact that we are good people makes our lives more difficult to boot. Thanks, God. There's another very familiar Christian argument in here, I think, at the end of the chapter, that's slightly disguised, and it's the "I just know" assertion that is often the argument of last resort when Christians are arguing with atheists. Lewis says that Christians are not vulnerable to arguments against their faith that cite the poor character of some other Christians because they just know that God is there. And this hearsay and chatter, Lewis says, just doesn't matter because they know that God is there. And a Christian who makes this argument might say to an atheist, you know, you don't understand because you're blind. You're not a Christian. You deny God. But I know because I'm a Christian. I feel God's presence. I know because I know because I know. And this can be frustrating to atheists to hear this sort of completely baseless, irrational statement offered as though it's evidence for anything. But if you're an atheist and you're arguing with a Christian and you hear them say that, I think the proper reaction is to smile. It's good news. It means you win the argument. And finally, chapter 11, the new men. Lewis begins the chapter by reminding us again that Christ does not want to improve us, he wants to transform us. And Lewis compares this transformation process to biological evolution. Just as man evolved from lower forms of life, he must also evolve further into something different. And Lewis calls this the next step or the new step. Evolution, he says, will take a sharp bend. It will go somewhere that it's never gone before, somewhere completely new. Or if you're a Christian, Lewis says, it already has taken that bend. It already has taken that next step. That next evolutionary step is Christ. He is the personification of it. He is the representation of that change from being creatures of God to being sons of God. And in this sense, Lewis admits it is not evolution, since it's not the result of any ongoing natural process, but rather the result of God entering something into nature from the outside that wasn't there before. And also, ideas about evolution are formed by studying the past, whereas this transformation is going to be totally new and totally unprecedented, and therefore it cannot be predicted just by looking at what has already happened. Lewis goes through a few more examples of how this new step is distinct from evolution. For instance, it's not the result of sexual reproduction. Lower creatures have not been able to take this next step because it's something that you have to take voluntarily, and they don't have the capacity to make that choice. Christ is the personification of the new step. He's not merely a new man, but he's the new man. In other words, unlike evolution, Christ is not the first member of a new species. He is the one and only member of the new species, and we can only become like him by contacting him and getting that good infection that Lewis continues to refer to. It doesn't come to us through heredity. It comes to us through contact with Christ. And unlike other evolutionary steps, this new step has been taken incredibly quickly. Even the 2,000 years since the life of Christ, Lewis says correctly, is like a flash of lightning in the whole scheme of history. The stakes are also very high. They're much higher than evolutionary stakes, says Lewis, because taking this step is like a baby being born. We're like a baby that has a choice as to whether or not it wants to be born. And we can either take the next step, that is, be born, or we can die. That's how Lewis puts it. We either choose to be born or we will die. The new men, that is, those who have taken the new step, are already here, Lewis says. And he seems to draw a distinction between these new men and most Christians. I think the new men are like the absolute best Christians, the one who have really been worked on and transformed by God. They seem to be a relative rarity, how Lewis describes them in the book. But he says they're here, they're all over the world, and they are recognizable if you know what to look for. They are humble, they are selfless. They're not like the religious people that we are used to seeing. They are the sort of people, Lewis says, that love you more but need you less. And he says that they recognize each other immediately, which Lewis reckons makes being holy like joining a secret society. Doesn't that sound cool? joining a secret society. I wonder if they get like a decoder ring. The new men are not all alike, however. They're distinguishable from each other. Although, when you become like Christ, that does mean that Christ's will and Christ's thoughts will become your will and your thoughts. The effect does not homogenize people, but rather it brings out their true selves, much as the right amount of salt brings out the full flavor of food. Lewis says that the more we are able to rid ourselves of our natural selves, the more Christ can enter into us and bring us into our true selves, the people that we were always supposed to be. To truly come to Christ, you must forget about yourself altogether. And Christ will give you your real self, and that true self will not come while you look for it. It'll only come when you look sincerely and completely for Christ. And Lewis finishes the book with this, quote, "Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find Him, and with Him everything else thrown in." Lewis uses evolution to illustrate the kind of transformation he's talking about, which I find interesting. I didn't mention it during the summary just there, but he even brings up that cosmic rays are responsible for a small amount of the genetic mutations that provide the raw material that makes evolution work. And he also mentions that there are educated people who doubt evolution, and I suspect that it is that concession which allows him to be taken as seriously as he is by modern Christian apologists, because many in the modern Christian apologetic community just reject evolution outright. Lewis says that these new men, these transformed Christians, aren't like the religious people that we meet as we come and go in our everyday lives. And I wonder, does that mean that they won't try to proselytize to me and talk to me about God and Jesus as though I'm a 6-year-old with no thoughts of my own on the subject? Because if that's the case, I wish there were more Christians like them around and fewer of the Ray Comfort variety. So here we are at the end of Mere Christianity. And it began, if you remember, as a protracted presentation of the moral argument, and it ends here with a restatement of Christian misanthropy and self-loathing. Your desires, your thoughts, even your very self. These things are dirty. These things are wrong. These things are diseased. They're the enemy. They are what is going to destroy you, and they have to be gotten rid of. They have to be disowned and destroyed. And they have to be replaced with what God wants for you. And I've said before that this kind of Christianity tells us that we are worthless without God, but reading these final chapters of Mere Christianity, I realize that it's even worse than that. We don't even have our true selves without God. It's not just our worth, but our identity, the very essence of our being, that is tied inextricably to God. Christopher Hitchens used to criticize the Christian worldview by describing the universe it posited as a celestial dictatorship. But as Lewis tells it, it's even worse than that. Not only are we under the authority of an omnipotent and omnipresent being, not only is there no such thing as privacy in this Christian worldview, there's no such thing as freedom, even within our own minds, because those of us who choose to think for ourselves and make our own decisions, we wind up suffering eternal torment, because to do that is a rejection of God and a separation of us from God, and we end up going to hell as a result of that. And if we accept God and we give ourselves over to Him, He will fundamentally transform who we are. He will rewire our brains. He will lobotomize us. Being yourself, being who you are naturally, and being allowed to decide for yourself who you should be and what you should do is not an option in the Christian universe. And again, I ask, why would anyone want this to be true? Lewis's presentation in the book is very skilled very articulate. He comes off actually most of the time as a likable guy, and his abilities as a writer and a communicator are a breath of fresh air after analyzing the prose of Lee fucking Strobel for 4 months before this. But most of what he writes here amounts to attractively packaged assertions with no evidence to back them up. Even his references to the Bible, as shitty a foundation for understanding reality as that is, are few and far between. It seems to mostly come directly from Lewis's imagination, and while I have no doubt that it was a nimble imagination, I see no reason to regard it as a source of objective truth about anything. Lewis often talks about Christianity as being a religion of facts. That's why it's so complicated, because we didn't make it up. It's a religion of facts. But most of the facts he discusses in Mere Christianity are things he could not possibly know. Lewis titled the book Mere Christianity because he meant it to be a description of the essential faith and not any particular school or denomination of Christianity. And another title with the same meaning might have been Simple Christianity. And while the word simple can mean uncomplicated, as Lewis intends mere to mean, it can also mean unsophisticated. And when I cut through the cleverness and the occasional elegance and eloquence of Lewis's presentation, I see that simple, in that second sense, is precisely what this is. Well, that's it for Mere Christianity. This is the last entry in the series. That's the whole book. I am going to do another series in this vein. The next one coming up is going to be an examination of William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith. And I'm going to get through this, and that'll be it probably for the time being of these sorts of series, the Atheist Read series. I'm going to come back to it after the Craig series eventually, but I think this trio of books, Case for Christ, Mere Christianity, and Reasonable Faith, will probably do me well enough that I'll need at least a little break in between before I dive back into something else. So that's the next series after this one. Watch for that. Reasonable Faith. Same sort of thing as this has been. And those of you who watched this and enjoyed it and got something out of it, thank you so much for paying attention, for being interested in this. I hope it's been of some use to you. Please continue to leave comments. Those of you who are discovering this series months or years after its original upload, please, I'm going to keep paying attention to it. Continue to leave comments. Continue to contact me with your thoughts and your opinions and your criticisms and whatever. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.